Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, July 27th, 2022. The Federal Reserve raises interest rates another 0.75 of a percentage point, part of its ongoing campaign to bring down high inflation. Fed Chair Jerome Powell in a news conference says he does not think the U.S. is currently in a recession. We'll hear from the chairman and talk with MarketWatch senior reporter Gregg Robb. President Joe Biden out of COVID-19 isolation after 2 negative tests, making an appearance in the White House Rose Garden, telling reporters, "My symptoms were mild, my recovery was quick, and I'm feeling great." President also promoting vaccine boosters, COVID tests, and treatments. Gun manufacturing executives testify before a House committee about assault weapons and mass shootings. Chair of the committee, Democrat Carolyn Maloney, saying the gun industry is profiting off the blood of innocent Americans. One of the CEO witnesses, Marty Daniel of Daniel Defense, responding, "These acts are committed by murderers. The murderers are responsible." Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the U.S. made a substantial proposal to Russia to bring home wrongfully detained WNBA star Brittany Griner and also Paul Whelan, who is serving a prison sentence in Russia. Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff taking part in a Wall of Remembrance dedication at the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, the wall etched with the names of U.S. and Korean soldiers who died. And on Capitol Hill, unveiling of a statue of famed aviator Amelia Earhart. This article at CNBC, the Federal Reserve on Wednesday enacted its second consecutive 0.75 percentage point interest rate increase as it seeks to tamp down runaway inflation without creating a recession. In taking the benchmark overnight borrowing rate to a range of 2.25% to 2.5%, the move in June and July represents the most stringent consecutive moves since the Fed began using the overnight funds rate as a principal tool of monetary policy in the early 1990s. While the Fed funds rate most directly impacts what banks charge each other for short-term loans, it feeds into a multitude of consumer products such as adjustable mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards. The increase takes the Fed funds rate to its highest level since December 2018. That from CNBC. The Fed Chair Jerome Powell holding a news conference today at Fed headquarters in Washington.
My colleagues and I are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down, and we're moving expeditiously to do so. We have both the tools we need and the resolve it will take to restore price stability on behalf of American families and businesses. The economy and the country have been through a lot over the past 2.5 years and have proved resilient. It is essential that we bring inflation down to our 2% goal if we are to have a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. From the standpoint of our congressional mandate to promote maximum employment and price stability, the current picture is plain to see. The labor market is extremely tight, and inflation is much too high. Against this backdrop, today the FOMC raised its policy interest rate by 0.75 of a percentage point and anticipates that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet.
The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. After his opening statement, he took reporters' questions, including this one on whether the U.S. is in a recession.
Thanks, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin from Axios. To build a little bit on what Steve was asking, do you believe the United States is currently in a recession? Will the GDP reading tomorrow affect that judgment one way or the other? And has your assessment of the risk of recession changed any in recent weeks?
So, I do not think the U.S. is currently in a recession. And the reason is there are just too many areas of the economy that are performing too well. And of course, I would point to the labor market in particular. As I mentioned, it's true that growth is slowing, and for reasons that we understand, really the growth was extraordinarily high last year, 5.5%. We would have expected growth to slow. There's also more slowing going on now. But if you look at the labor market, you've got growth, I think payroll jobs averaging 450,000 per month. That's a remarkably strong level for this state of affairs. The unemployment rate at near a 50-year low at 3.6%. All of the wage measures that we track are running very strong. So this is a very strong labor market, and it's just not consistent with 2.7 million people hired in the first half of the year. It doesn't make sense that the economy would be in recession with this kind of thing happening. So I don't think the U.S. economy is in recession right now. Haven't seen it, and we'll just have to see what it says. I don't. I mean, I would say generally the GDP numbers do have a tendency to be revised pretty significantly. It's very hard. It's very hard to accumulate U.S. GDP. It's a large economy, and a lot of work and judgment goes into that. But you tend to take first GDP reports, I think, with a grain of salt. But of course, it's something we'll be looking at.
That was Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. Joining us now on the phone is Gregg Robb, senior reporter with MarketWatch. Thanks for being with us. The Fed chair saying definitively he doesn't think the U.S. is in a recession right now. There's been a lot of debate about the definition of a recession. Is it just symbolism and labels, or is there something more to this?
It's a big question. I think Powell was like Muhammad Ali. He was rope-a-dope on the recession question. There is a chance that the economy will go into recession. It's not a great thing. It's like a recession is a real a break in the economy, and people will lose their jobs. He said a couple things about recession. He said he doesn't think there is one. He thinks, hang on a second. He thinks that he doesn't think there is one. He doesn't think that but he didn't say if one comes, the Fed would alter its course, which is kind of what people kind of get at with him. The market thinks that he's going to blink, that the economy is the Fed's not going to raise rates very high because the economy is slowing down. So it's pretty consequential.
The Fed raising rates again by 0.75 percentage point. You wrote ahead of today's announcement that one of the most vexing questions is just how high they will have to push up interest rates to cool down the U.S. economy and inflation. Did we get any more information about how high that will be?
Actually, no. Powell doesn't like to talk about that. It's not. He pointed people to the Fed's latest forecast, which they put out in June, which said that their highest the interest rate will go is 4% sometime next year. Many people in the markets and many former Fed officials think that the Fed funds rate has to go 5% or higher to get inflation down. But that's a consequential step. It's not something to think about lightly, and Powell kind of avoids it. But he sticks to their forecast of 4%. It depends whether you're in the camp of you think the Fed has this, the Fed's got this, that inflation can come down and there can be a soft landing, or if you're in the camp that thinks the Fed doesn't have this and that inflation is going to be sticky and persistent. There seems to be two camps still going on, and Powell is in the one camp. He thinks he's got this. So we heard more about that from him because that was the argument he was making today.
As you said, he sounded very confident of achieving the goals, but he also said the path towards those goals has narrowed, and he recognizes the risk of doing too much or too little. How narrow is the path that they're walking on?
Somebody said to me, it's kind of like trying to land an aircraft on one of those aircraft carriers in the stormy weather. It's not something you do lightly. It's another way somebody else said it to me when an economist I talked to said there's just no easy way out for them. They need to get inflation down. The economy is slowing. They need to, the labor market is pretty tight. They need the labor market not to be tight. That means people being laid off maybe from their jobs and higher unemployment. They need to get inflation down. There is a real sense that in order to do that, they have to slow things down, maybe a lot to do it. So that's what he's saying. But on the other hand, there is still this sense that we're in a pandemic, not the same as before. Inflation went up fast, and it can come down fast. That's why everybody's going to be watching the data.
We're talking with Gregg Robb from MarketWatch. Did anything else in the Fed chair's news conference hit you as making news today?
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty good performance by him in the recent past. I think he was on top of his game. There wasn't a lot news there. He had to be hawkish. He was hawkish in most regards, but the market seemed to like it. he has this ability to kind of say tough things and people like it. So maybe he was a little bit less hawkish than he was in July, but he was sticking to his guns that the Fed is focused on its weight. A couple of times he was asked about the joblessness and rising joblessness, and he said that they're really looking at inflation first. So that's we'll see. The market, like I said before, the market thinks they're going to blink. The market thinks there's going to come a time where the economy is just really suffering and the Fed will have to stop raising rates. But that day is down the road.
Gregg Robb is a senior reporter with MarketWatch. Find his stories at marketwatch.com, and on Twitter he's at GRobb2000. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Wall Street today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average closing up 436 points. NASDAQ up 469, S&P up 102. CNN says that it's due in part to the Fed Chair Jerome Powell suggesting the central bank could slow the pace and size of future interest rate hikes if the economy cools. At the White House today, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre getting questions about what the Fed Chair said about recession.
Fed Chair Jay Powell, after raising rates again today, he said in his press conference that the U.S. economy is not currently in a recession, but that the path to have a soft landing clearly has narrowed, which translated out of the jargon means that it's much more likely that we will have a recession as they continue to try to fight inflation in the future. So is that the White House's assessment as well, and what would you do to kind of make that less likely?
So here's what he said. I'll quote him directly. I don't think the U.S. is currently in a recession. There's just too many areas in the economy that are performing well. And then he points to the labor market, the very strong labor market that we know are one of the factors that economists and experts look at. Right now, we're seeing that strong labor market with about 400,000 jobs that have been created each month. We see unemployment at 3.6. There was the state unemployment numbers that came out last week with 21 states that are at 6% or lower. And so the way that we see is that we are not currently in a recession or a pre-recession. And look, we're going to let the Fed do its business. We're going to let them continue to be independent, and that's what the president has said. They are committed to making sure that we lower inflation or tackle inflation for the American people. So we're going to let them do their job. They have the monetary policy to do that. So I won't speak further into exactly what they're doing and how that's going to look for them.
You noted we are not currently in a recession, you don't think, but are you concerned that these Fed rate hikes could push you into a recession?
Look, we, again, it is, we're not going to comment on the monetary policy steps that the Federal Reserve is taking. They are an independent agency, and we are going to give them the room to do the job that they're doing. And so right now, the president has laid out his plan to lower inflation. We have seen what has happened with gas prices the last 43 days, a steep decline, a steep decline that we haven't seen in a decade, again, to help give families a little bit of breathing room, and that's what the president has talked about. We have also seen food prices go down just a little bit, and so we're going to continue to do that. There's the drug prices bill, the reconciliation legislation that's going to continue to address lowering costs for Americans, and so that's going to be our focus there.
The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre getting reporters' questions in the White House briefing room. This was after the Federal Reserve announced that it is raising interest rates 0.75 percentage point. This morning, before that announcement, House Republicans holding a news conference on Capitol Hill. Carol Miller of West Virginia speaking about the Biden administration's economic policies and that question of a recession.
Sadly, we're here today because the Democrats are more concerned with the definition of the word recession. They seem to struggle with definitions. They're more concerned with that than the looming recession. And for Democrats in Washington, they like to play the word game, and it's being played with the media. But in West Virginia, the recession is very real. Real people are being really hurt because of failed liberal policies. Inflation is over 9%. Gasoline is over $4 a gallon. Our economy is shrinking, and the D.C. Democrats just keep spending and spending more and more money. If we see a second quarter of contracting in tomorrow's economic data, you would hope that the Democrats and the Biden administration would actually admit that we're in a recession. If they deny it, people in West Virginia and across America will continue to suffer. When it comes to recession, the Democrats aren't in touch with reality. They seem to care more about fixing Biden's plummeting approval ratings than they do about an economic plan. America are feeling this through and through. I urge them to stop with the games, accept reality, and join with the Republicans to solve the problems. Open up our energy resources now.
Congresswoman Carol Miller of West Virginia, news conference today on Capitol Hill, along with other House Republicans. This is Washington Today. A story at thehill.com. The Senate voted with a large bipartisan majority Wednesday to pass a $280 billion bill to subsidize the domestic chip manufacturing industry and provide tens of billions of dollars for scientific research to keep the U.S. technological edge in the global economy. The 64-33 vote caps more than a year of negotiations over the bill, which stalled for months in the House because of progressive Democrats' objections to trade-related and other provisions in the bill, such as language to provide security safeguards for technological research. That from The Hill. One of the yes votes today, Senator Mark Kelly, Democrat from Arizona, speaking on the Senate floor.
Microchips go in nearly everything we use. They're in the TV or the cell phone that folks are watching this on. And they're in life-saving medical devices. And they're in our most advanced weapon systems. The United States invented microchips. And once, we produced 40% of the world's supply. Today, we only produce about 12%. And we don't produce any of the most advanced microchips. Now, that leaves us vulnerable to disruptions in the supply chain, like the current microchip shortage that has halted production lines and driven up prices. If you've recently tried to buy a new car, and waited months or paid more than you were expecting, the microchip shortage is a big reason why. So, we've worked on a plan. Republicans and Democrats with incentives to make sure the world's leading microchip manufacturers grow their operations here in the United States instead of in China or Europe. It also boosts research so that the most advanced chips in the world are invented and produced right here in the United States.
Senator Mark Kelly, Democrat from Arizona, on the Senate floor before the vote to pass this bill. He mentioned it was a bipartisan final vote. Republican Senator Todd Young of Indiana also speaking.
This bill will make America stronger, safer, and more prosperous. And it's desperately needed. How do we know? Because the Chinese Communist Party has actively lobbied against this legislation. They know this bill is bad for China and good for the United States of America. This bill is about securing our country, giving our people the tools to flourish, and ensuring America continues its global research role. It's been a long journey to get to this point, but history will show that by passing this CHIPS Plus bill, we're confronting the challenges of today and building a prosperous and secure tomorrow for all Americans.
Senator Todd Young, Republican from Indiana, on the Senate floor. More details about the bill, again, from the article at thehill.com. It will provide $54 billion in total appropriations for chips and public wireless supply chain innovation, including $39 billion in financial assistance to build, expand, and modernize domestic semiconductor facilities, and $11 billion for Department of Commerce Research and Development. It would also provide $81 billion to the National Science Foundation, including $20 billion for the NSF Tech Directorate and create a 25% tax credit for investments in semiconductor manufacturing. Of the final vote, there were 33 Republicans voting no and one who caucuses with the Democrats, independent Bernie Sanders of Vermont, and he also explained why on the Senate floor.
Somehow, the deficit is of great concern when it comes to providing help to working families, to low-income Americans, to children, to seniors. But it's not a concern when you provide massive corporate welfare for enormously profitable multinational corporations. I guess, Mr. President, when the semiconductor industry spends $19 million on lobbying this year alone, and when Intel spends $100 million on lobbying and campaign contributions over the past 20 years, when that industry says jump, the response from Congress is how high? That is what a political system dominated by big money looks like.
Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, on the Senate floor, one of the no votes, the only no vote in the Democratic caucus on this bill. After it passed, President Joe Biden tweeting a photo of himself sitting at a table with aides watching that vote, and including this, he wrote, "I took a moment today to watch the Senate pass the CHIPS and Science Act, a bipartisan bill that will accelerate semiconductor manufacturing in the U.S. It will lower prices, create jobs, and critically decrease our reliance on imported chips. The House should pass it ASAP, as soon as possible." And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is planning to bring it up for a vote before the end of the week, when the House is scheduled to go on its August recess. President Biden today also making his first public appearance since testing positive for COVID-19 last Thursday. The president was in the White House Rose Garden saying that he has tested negative twice, feeling great, and also reminding Americans they have access to the tools that helped him through the illness.
I've just tested negative for COVID-19 after isolating for 5 days. Thankfully, I'll now be able to return to work in person, but I want to thank you all for your well wishes, your prayers over this past week and the calls I've gotten. I also want to thank the medical team here at the White House for the incredible care they gave me. Fortunately, thankfully, God willing, my symptoms were mild, my recovery was quick, and I'm feeling great. The entire time I was in isolation, I was able to work, to carry out the duties of the office and without any interruption. It's a real statement on where we are in the fight against COVID-19. Right now, we are facing a new variant, the BA.5 variant, a very transmissible version of Omicron variant we saw here this past winter. In fact, this new variant that infected me is getting a lot of people infected all around the world, not just here in the United States. We should take precautions to try to slow the spread of this virus. My administration has made billions of dollars in funding available to improve ventilation in our schools and our public buildings. We've made tests widely available so you can take one before attending a large indoor gatherings or visiting with high-risk individuals. We've made high-quality masks available for free, so you should consider wearing a mask when you're in a crowded indoor public place. These precautions add an extra layer of protection for you and for those around you. But the reality is that BA.5 means many of us are still going to get COVID, even if we take the precautions. That doesn't mean we're doing anything wrong. Unfortunately, this COVID is still with us, as it has been for 2.5 years. But our fight against COVID is making a huge difference. What's different now is our ability to protect ourselves from serious illness due to COVID. In fact, that's radically different today than it was just a year ago. COVID isn't gone, but even with cases climbing in this country, COVID deaths are down nearly 90%. And when I took office, that's 90% difference between today and when I took office. That's what's new. That's what's new in COVID response. Different from where we were just a year ago. Even if you get COVID, you can avoid winding up with a severe case. You can now prevent most COVID deaths, and that's because 3 free tools my administration has invested in and distributed this past year: booster shots, at-home tests, easy-to-use effective treatments.
President Biden in the White House Rose Garden today. His physician, Dr. Kevin O'Connor, putting out a memo. He's been doing this every day. Memo to the White House Press Secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, about the president's condition. And today, writing, the president's symptoms have been steadily improving and are almost completely resolved. And that because of the president's 2 negative tests last night and this morning, he'll discontinue his strict isolation measures. But Dr. O'Connor also adding this: as I've stated previously, the president continues to be specifically conscientious to protect any of the executive residence, White House, Secret Service, and other staff whose duties require any, albeit socially distanced, proximity to him. For this reason, he will wear a well-fitting mask for 10 full days any time he is around others. And also, this in the memo, acknowledging the potential for so-called rebound COVID positivity observed in a small percentage of patients treated with Paxlovid. The president will increase his testing cadence, both to protect people around him and to assure early detection of any return of viral replication. Also, an announcement today from the Food and Drug Administration about monkeypox. They have approved the use of an additional monkeypox vaccine manufactured in Denmark that clears the way for about 800,000 doses to be shipped to the U.S. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Here are some of the live programs on Thursday on C-SPAN Radio. At 10 a.m. Eastern, Assistant Attorney General for National Security Matt Olson testifies before the House Judiciary Committee. And at 7 p.m. Eastern, the annual Congressional baseball game, Democrats versus Republicans from Nationals Park in Washington. Thursday, live on C-SPAN Radio. Listen on your smart speaker, say, play C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. This from the New York Times. The leading manufacturers of assault rifles used to perpetuate the deadliest mass shootings in the United States have collected more than $1 billion in revenue over the past decade as gun violence across the country has surged, according to a House investigation that was set to be presented on Capitol Hill today. The findings released before the hearing on the marketing of assault rifles indicate that the gun industry has thrived by selling and marketing military-grade weapons to civilians, specifically targeting and playing to the insecurities of young men, while some have made thinly veiled references to white supremacist groups. That from the New York Times. The House Oversight and Reform Committee opened the investigation into the gun manufacturing industry in May after the mass shootings in Uvalde, Texas, and also Buffalo, New York. The committee chair, Carolyn Maloney, Democrat from New York, here questioning 2 of the witnesses who are CEOs of gun manufacturing companies, Marty Daniel from Daniel Defense and Christopher Killoy from Sturm, Ruger and Company.
It seems to me that if a company really cared that its products were being used to kill scores of Americans, it would stop selling them. But of course, the gun industry won't do that because they're making lots and lots of money from these weapons. As shown in the chart behind me, over the last 10 years, Daniel Defense collected more than $500 million in revenue selling AR-15 style assault weapons, the weapon of choice in too many mass shootings. Ruger also made over $500 million on these weapons, and Smith & Wesson made more than $600 million. That is the very definition of putting profits over people. Today, the committee room, there are victims and surviving family members from the Highland Park and Uvalde shootings. Mr. Daniel, you have sent thoughts and prayers to the victims of Uvalde, but you have never accepted responsibility for selling the weapons that killed these innocent children. And you testified earlier that there has been a decline in personal responsibility. I want to give you the opportunity now to show personal responsibility. Will you accept personal responsibility for your company's role in this tragedy and apologize to the families of Uvalde?
Chairwoman Maloney, these acts are committed by murderers. The murderers are responsible.
Reclaiming my client. Mr. Killoy, how about you? Will you apologize to the victims here today and victims around our country and their families in Sutherland Springs, Boulder, and other cities who were harmed by your products?
Congresswoman, with all due respect, while as I grieve like all Americans at these tragic incidences, again, to blame the firearm, the particular firearm in use here that we're talking about, modern sporting rifles.
Thank you.
To blame the firearm as an inanimate object.
Reclaiming my time. So let me get this straight, and with all due respect, you market weapons of war to civilians and children. You make millions by selling them, but when someone pulls the trigger, you refuse to accept responsibility. And I would call that a staggering lack of accountability. I hope the American people are paying attention today. It is clear that gun makers are not going to change unless Congress forces them to finally put people over profits.
Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, Democrat from New York, chair of the Oversight and Reform Committee, questioning Christopher Killoy from Sturm, Ruger and Company and Marty Daniel from Daniel Defense. Also at this hearing, Republican Congressman Jody Hice of Georgia. Here are his questions to Marty Daniel.
My colleagues seem to forget that the American people have a right to own guns. It's a constitutional right to defend themselves, and yet we have a perpetual barrage of politicized buzzwords like have already been used here this morning, like assault weapons and weapons of war, to support arbitrary gun grabs, not from criminals, but from law-abiding American citizens. And it's time that we see some changes. Mr. Daniel, I'd like to go to you. There are approximately 8.5 million Americans purchased a firearm for the first time in 2020, and this is a trend that's continued to go up for the last several years. Does your company make or produce any illegal product?
We don't make any illegal products. We abide by all the laws. We have a very professional compliance department. We focus on always doing the right thing. We focus on, we tell our employees every month in our monthly meetings that we need to be 100% compliant 100% of the time. And we are known to have a great system of making sure that we're everything is legal.
And I have been to your company. I've toured it. It's an amazing place. Why do you believe so many Americans are choosing to exercise their constitutional rights for firearms and purchase firearms, particularly things like the AR-15, which seems to be under attack this morning?
Congressman, I believe our data agrees with what you have stated, that there were 8 million plus new gun owners in 2020. That number has continued. Those types of numbers have continued through today, equaling 16 million plus new gun owners. Our internal data shows us, sir, that less than 20% of those new gun owners who have never owned a gun before are Republicans, and that people who have made a decision in the past to never own a gun have changed their minds and are buying guns in unprecedented quantities.
And I'm sure that's primarily to defend themselves because we're soft on crime. We're not dealing with the real issues.
Congressman Jody Hice and Marty Daniel of Daniel Defense. Find today's House Oversight and Reform Committee hearing in its entirety at our video library, cspan.org. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, confirming today that a bill to ban assault weapons and a package of policing bills will not be coming up for debate and votes in the full House this week. CNN reports that House Democrats were divided over how to structure a package of messaging bills on crime before the August recess. Vulnerable Democrats, also known as frontliners, wanted to pass police funding bills to combat defund the police messages to help ahead of the 2022 midterms, while the Congressional Black Caucus and progressives have concerns about it and wanted accountability language included in the package for police officers. From Fox News, WNBA star Brittany Griner, who has been detained in Russia on drug charges since February, could return to the U.S. after Secretary of State Antony Blinken revealed Wednesday the Biden administration has offered a substantial proposal for her return that includes American Paul Whelan. Blinken announced this during a news conference in Washington.
In the coming days, I expect to speak with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov for the first time since the war began. I plan to raise an issue that's a top priority for us: the release of Americans Paul Whelan and Brittany Griner, who've been wrongfully detained and must be allowed to come home. We put a substantial proposal on the table weeks ago to facilitate their release. Our governments have communicated repeatedly and directly on that proposal, and I'll use the conversation to follow up personally and, I hope, move us toward a resolution.
After Secretary of State Antony Blinken gave his opening statement, it dealt mostly with Russia's war in Ukraine, now 6 months in. He took questions from reporters. MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell asking about Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan and the deal on Ukrainian and Russian grain exports.
There are reports that the administration has decided that this substantial offer is to trade convicted Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout. That's a big offer. Just last week, Bill Burns called him a creep in an interview with me. But you want to get Griner and Paul Whelan out. So what is the prospect of getting Paul Whelan and Brittany Griner out by making such a big trade, arguably over the opposition of the Justice Department? He's serving a 25-year sentence. And what can you accomplish in a conversation with Lavrov to try to get this grain deal locked in, since they bombed Odessa within 24 hours of agreeing to the deal? How can you trust anything that Lavrov and the Russians agreed to?
Thanks, Andrea. When it comes to our efforts to secure the return home of Paul Whelan and Brittany Griner, you'll understand that I can't and won't get into any of the details of what we proposed to the Russians over the course of so many weeks now.
Well, can you talk about why you would make such an important, why you would put what you call a substantial offer on the table?
So here's what I can say about this. First, as I mentioned, we've conveyed this on a number of occasions and directly to Russian officials. And my hope would be that in speaking to Foreign Minister Lavrov, I can advance the efforts to bring them home. We have two imperatives when it comes to arbitrarily, wrongfully detained Americans anywhere in the world, including in Russia, including the cases of Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan. And I say this because, more than unfortunately, horrifically, this is a practice, as you know, that many countries engage in, and one that we are resolutely working to end, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But we have two objectives. We, of course, want to see those who are wrongfully detained be released and be able to return home. At the same time, it's important that we work to reinforce the global norm against these arbitrary detentions, against what is truly a horrific practice. So we're working concertedly on both. We've demonstrated with Trevor Reed, who came home a few months ago, that the president is prepared to make tough decisions if it means the safe return of Americans. At the same time, we are working with partners around the world to use all of the relevant tools at our disposal, including some that were announced just recently in an executive order that the president released, to respond to and impose costs on those who engage in this practice. And I believe we can actually fulfill both imperatives. And let me just say this as well. I think you can expect to hear me in the weeks and months ahead speak more to the efforts that we're making to reinforce this global norm against arbitrary detention, to deter countries from doing this in the first place.
Matt.
Can you speak to the grain?
Oh, I'm sorry, the grain. I apologize. I didn't get to, Andrea, the second part of the question. Look, Andrea, it was incredibly powerful when we were in Bali a few weeks ago at the G20 to see foreign ministers from around the world demand that Russia end its blockade of Odessa and of the grain that has been blocked in Ukraine for 6 months, more than 20 million tons. And minister after minister did this from countries around the world geographically to such an extent that Foreign Minister Lavrov decided not to return for the rest of the session that the G20 foreign ministers were holding. And then I think the steps that we've seen Russia take in at least agreeing on paper to allow grain to leave Ukraine is in response to the pressure that Russia is feeling, not just from us, not just from G7 countries or even G20 countries, but from countries around the world who are saying whatever they think about anything else, end this blockade, allow the grain to leave, allow us to feed our people, allow prices to come down. But the test, of course, now is whether there's actual implementation of the agreement. That's what we're looking at. We'll see in the coming days whether what Russia signed it's serious about, whether the grain gets out. That's what we're looking toward. The bombings that you saw the other day, I mean, step back for a second. Irrespective of what they were aiming at, by what right does Russia have to bomb anything in Ukraine or anything in Odessa or anything in the port? None, zero. Anything it's doing is to further its efforts to conquer Ukraine, which have and will fail. But in the case of grain specifically, what we need to see, what we're looking to, but what the world is looking to, more important is whether those ships begin to sail, whether the grain starts to move. We'll find out in the next few days.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken at a news conference at the State Department in Washington. More on Brittany Griner, Voice of America, reporting that she admitted arriving in Russia in February with vape canisters containing cannabis oil in her luggage. She testified at a court hearing Wednesday that a language interpreter provided to her translated only a fraction of what was being said as authorities arrested her. The article goes on. Griner, who faces up to 10 years in prison if convicted of transporting drugs, said she was instructed by officials to sign documents at the Moscow airport without them providing an explanation for what she was acknowledging. The article says it's the 6th session of her slow-moving trial. U.S. Army Chorus and Band at the Korean War Veterans Memorial in the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Dedication today of a wall of remembrance etched with the names of 36,000 Americans and 7,100 members of the Korean augmentation to the U.S. Army who fought alongside them. The war in Korea, 1950 to 1953. One of the speakers at today's ceremony, Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff, husband of Vice President Kamala Harris.
Today is such an important day. We commemorate the sacrifice of those Americans and Koreans who bravely fought together, side by side, to defend our freedom, laying the foundation for a thriving, democratic Republic of Korea and a strong, unbreakable United States Republic of Korea alliance. As the General said, today is the day that we mark the culmination of efforts over many, many years by American and Korean veterans, their families, the Korean War Veterans Memorial Foundation, to make this wall of remembrance a reality. And today is that reality. It's a beautiful monument. It's a poignant reminder of the individual sacrifices of the more than 36,000 U.S. service members and the more than 7,000 Korean troops who served together and died together in Korea. Their names are now forever engraved here on our incredible Washington Mall.
Second Gentleman of the United States Doug Emhoff at the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington. About the Remembrance Wall, Washington Post writes that funding for the $22 million project came from donations from the people of the United States and South Korea. according to the Park Service and Memorials Foundation. Another dedication ceremony in the U.S. Capitol in Washington, a statue of aviator Amelia Earhart.
Amelia was a woman who was not afraid to fly.
Performance by Susan Graham White, her song, The Sound of Wings, about Amelia Earhart. Earhart's records include first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean in 1932, first woman to fly solo from Hawaii to California in 1935, and of course it was 1937 she was attempting to fly around the world when her plane disappeared in the Pacific Ocean. Her statue in the U.S. Capitol donated by Kansas, and at today's ceremony, Governor Laura Kelly.
Amelia Earhart was born and raised in Atchison, Kansas, a small town overlooking the Missouri River. From a very early age, Amelia was a dreamer. Her dreams went far beyond the banks of that river and far beyond the prescribed gender roles of her time. Kansans have long celebrated our women trailblazers, like Susanna Salter, the first woman elected mayor in the United States in 1887, long before women had the right to vote. Like Georgia Niece Gregg, who during the Truman administration became the first woman to serve as United States Treasurer. And Lucinda Todd, who actually lit the flame that resulted in the 1954 decision, Brown versus Board of Education, a ruling that changed the world as we know it. So it is fitting today we're dedicating a statue in honor of one of the most notable of our pioneering women. Let it be an inspiration for all, particularly our young girls, for generations to come. Let them stare up at this work of art and think that they, like Amelia, can dream the impossible dream.
Kansas Governor Laura Kelly, a Democrat, at the dedication in the U.S. Capitol in Washington today. Also there, the congressional delegation from Kansas, both Republicans and Democrats, and also the bipartisan House and Senate leadership. Each state in the union allowed 2 statues of people they choose, notables, and states may replace them from time to time. Amelia Earhart will be replacing the statue of former Kansas U.S. Senator John James Ingalls that was installed in 1905. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get Washington's top stories sent to you every day. Sign up at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.